without further ado, let's get the evening going. We'd like to thank Fibershed and Rebecca Burgess, who will be up to introduce tonight's speakers on carbon conversation. So again, without further ado, Rebecca.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Sorry, I'm a little froggy and bloated, but I just wanted to thank everybody who will be speaking tonight. This event is really about a community conversation around the Carbon Cycle Institute, whose members are here, and I'm included in that membership. Fibershed is strategically partnering in 2014 with the Carbon Cycle Institute due to our call to action around climate change. And when we started to understand the impacts of making climate beneficial decisions with our clothing, some of the most amazing life cycle assessment results came out, and I was like, wow, if we could manage agricultural carbon in ways that the Marin Carbon Project has elucidated, we could see that sheep grazing on lands managed in this way could yield wool that comes with it a beautiful carbon benefit to it. And if we run that wool through a life cycle and a supply chain of renewable energy powered systems, we can create carbon beneficial clothing with net carbon benefit. So as consumers, we could technically start mitigating the climate crisis through what we wear. And we do need to be thinking about material culture and shifts in material culture as we move forward, from the food to the fiber to the fuel. It's all critical at this point. So this group of people is generally in Sacramento talking to agencies. It's a wonderful opportunity that they're here in the public to hear from you and for you to hear from them. And so do you guys want to all come and just sit here and we can all firing squad. So this event was seeded through an email that Fibershed put out, and what we started to do was collect questions from the general public. Before we get into those questions, I'm going to let each of these individuals introduce themselves to you, so you know their background and who they all are.
Good evening. Thanks for coming. My name is Torri Estrada. I work with the Carbon Cycle Institute. We do spend a little time in Sacramento, but we also spend a lot of time in Marin and other places. I work on policy and economic incentives for the group, and so glad to be here. Thanks.
My name is John Wick, and with Jeff Creque, I co-founded the Marin Carbon Project. Currently, I'm managing molecules and microorganisms and drops of water at the watershed scale on a ranch in Nicasio, and I'm having a lot of fun doing that.
Hi, I'm Marcia DeLonge. I'm an ecosystem scientist and atmospheric scientist. I'm working at UC Berkeley as a postdoctoral researcher, and that's in Wendy Silver's lab, and she's been the lead on the science team of the Marin Carbon Project. So I've been there for 3 years now, and I've been doing a lot of work on the life cycle assessment that Rebecca mentioned, as well as field research in Marin. And just recently started working with Fibershed to do a life cycle assessment for them also. So great to be here, thank you.
Howdy, my name is Jeff Creque. I've been working in agriculture in Marin County for since 1979, in organic systems primarily. I'm a rangeland ecologist by training, and an agricultural ecologist by proclivity, I guess. And a member of the, founding member, as John said, of the Marin Carbon Project and of the Carbon Cycle Institute.
Great.
All right, thank you all. So the first question actually was about, can you share first with us information on the 5 carbon pools and maybe what the difference is? This came from Alan Tompkins, who's Hopkins, sorry, I apologize. And part of the discussion around the 5 carbon pools is that carbon is, there's a certain amount of it on planet Earth. It can only come and enter planet Earth in additionality through like a meteor. There's no other way to have carbon enter the system. It's just fixed, and it's constantly cycling through 5 pools. And right now we are sitting in the biosphere, and we are all we are carbon-based life forms in one carbon pool, which is the biosphere, which is between basically heaven and earth, or sky and soil. That's one pool. And then there's the pedosphere, which is where soil carbon exists. And then below that is the lithosphere, where fossil carbon exists, and that's where oil and gas come from. And then if you go, atmospheric, the atmosphere is another pool. And that's where we currently have 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide lodged in our atmosphere. Then there's the oceans that are trying to absorb that carbon, and carbonic acid is formed, and that's how carbon shows up in our oceans. And they are acidifying due to this imbalance in our carbon cycle. What I love about the Carbon Cycle Institute is that we are looking at and approaching climate change not from demonizing carbon by its very nature. We're actually saying carbon is beneficial. It just happens to be in the wrong place. It's in the wrong pool. There's too much of it up here. We need to draw it down, because actually when it's in the soil, when it becomes agricultural carbon, it's a great benefit to our soils. It increases water holding capacity. We'll find out more about that. It increases forage for our animals, and it creates very rich soil. So it's all about where the carbon is, and I think that understanding of a cycle instead of a fixed problem, and just thinking about emissions reduction as the climate crisis solution is not enough. We need to think about carbon as mobile. And so that's really where the carbon pools come into this as a foundation for what you're going to hear subsequently. And then the second question are really, what are the results, given this understanding of the carbon pools and how carbon cycles? That was the foundation for the Marin Carbon Project research. And what were the results of that research? John, do you want to start?
Sure. So in 2007, Jeff Creque and I asked a question: can management of grazed rangelands increase or result in the increase of soil carbon? And in 2007, December 2007, we were able to ask that question of Dr. Wendy Silver, a biogeochemist at UC Berkeley. And at that point in time, she said, I doubt it, and I doubt you could measure it. And Jeff had enough confidence that gave me the courage to press on with the project. And we organized a baseline survey of soil levels of land under management in Marin County and some parts of Sonoma. This is rangeland that's grazed, and it's typical of dairy pasture and beef pastures. And we needed to get a background level of carbon before we knew or could experiment whether we could add carbon to that pool. And during that soil survey of 35 sites in Marin and Sonoma, we found something amazing. We found a broad range of carbon levels, and it was from 30 to 150 tons of carbon per hectare. And the high carbon sites had all had wet dairy manure applied to them as a disposal solution. But that was exciting, because that suggested perhaps that a topical application of an organic amendment could result in soil carbon increases. So based on that and several other things, we did a series of experiments on my ranch and up in the Sierras, where we tested that idea by using compost rather than wet dairy manure. And the results are management can enhance soil carbon in a form in the soil that's permanent and significant. And it's based on that exciting news that we've launched a whole range of other projects. Do you want to talk any further on that?
The question on the table when we started was, could we enhance soil carbon through management, some management practice? And then the question became, well, what happens if we do that? Is that a good thing? And so my suggestion was, well, let's just add some carbon and see what happens. And the easiest way to do that was to throw some compost on the ground. So that's what we did. And we chose compost as opposed to manure, although our data up to that point had been, was indicated that manure was one way to do that. But we also knew there were some problems with manure. Manure carries a lot of viable weed seeds. Manure carries a lot of readily leachable nutrients, subject to runoff, rain events, and that kind of thing. So, and it can carry some pathogens. So we wanted to use a much more stable, long-term organic material that was weed-free, pathogen-free, and that came down to compost. So that's how we decided to try this out with compost. So we put half an inch of compost out at John's Ranch, and we repeated that at the Sierra Foothill Research Station at Browns Valley.
And so what we saw within the first year was a 50% increase of grass production on the treated plots compared to the control plots. What we saw was 26,000 liters more water per hectare compared to the control plots. What we also saw was that the control plots were losing carbon to the atmosphere, and there are some very interesting explanations about why that might be happening. But we're stepping into a system that's crashing, losing carbon. It's become a source. And by bumping it with a little bit of compost one time, we knocked it into a new state where it started to sequester carbon on its own. And the way this happens is by putting an organic amendment on the top of the soil microorganisms and different processes bring that carbon down into the soil, and that carbon changes the characteristics of the soil. It starts holding more water in a plant-available form. And as that happens, more plants grow, which then pulls more carbon in, which holds more water, which causes more plant growth. The second year, without any further compost, we saw an additional increase in soil carbon. And then the third year, without an additional compost application, we saw more carbon. And the fourth year, and the fifth year. So what we did, by simply putting a little bit of carbon on the top of the soil, the whole system responded to that at a higher function, and on its own now is intaking carbon again and again and again. The century model suggests that that will continue for decades. That's a very exciting impact from a single event. And it's based on that we're very excited about everything else related to agriculture, because potentially now the production of food, fuel, fiber, and flora can all be done in a way that's climate beneficial by removing massive amounts of carbon from the atmosphere, restoring function to the systems, while providing for our human cultural needs.
Nice.
Yeah, good.
So I like the idea of referring back to the Commonwealth Club, if anyone heard the climate change conversation the Commonwealth Club had, I think, last week, where there was a scientist asked about geoengineering, nuclear, what's your preferred strategy for mitigating the climate crisis? And what was put on the table were a series of high-tech solutions. So the scientist who was replying to how do you solve the climate crisis was given options of nuclear, carbon capture, geoengineering in several forms, seeding the clouds, and also putting iron in the ocean. And I thought about all of these technologies that are put on the table, and the general media and the public is being told that the solutions have to be high-tech in response to what seems like what got us into this was some form of technology. So what'll get us out is all these forms of technology, which is against the Albert Einstein quote completely. That the mind that created the problem is not the same mind that will unwind or unfold this from into state of solution. So I would just like to say I'm excited by the low-tech aspect of this and the simplicity and the elegance of it. And then that leads me to the follow-up question.
I want to tap on just a little bit. So this is actually a very, very high-tech solution, but all of that technology is in the science of measurement and monitoring and informing our biological processes. So it is very high-tech. We're using mass spectrometers and biochips, and I mean, there's never been a more appropriate time to be having these inquiries, because we have the tools and technologies to inform ourselves. And now we can start looking at time as a tool, timing, and work with existing biological systems. And that's what's exciting about this.
Good point. Science used to measure instead of manipulate. So how much land needs to be covered with compost to draw down enough carbon to solve our problems?
Every inch we can.
That's a very exciting, wonderful question. And the temptation is to give a very simple answer to a wonderfully complex problem. There is no direct conversion for parts per million to tons of carbon or petagrams of carbon, but we can make an approximation or an estimate. And then the other question is, on my ranch, what we saw was a range of results. We have very heterogeneous soils, so we saw different sequestration rates in different research plots. The Sierra sites were more uniform, if I remember right, and they actually had the highest sequestration sites. So we don't quite know yet what the soil's behavior is going to be with a uniform treatment. But with our worst, or lowest, or most conservative, I guess scientists say, right? Most conservative estimates, we know that there are 3.3 billion hectares of rangeland on Earth. Rangeland systems are made up mostly of grass, some brush, some trees. They're the single largest cover type on Earth, and most of them are grazed. And grazing management accounts for over half human occupation on the planet. So working on that system, a small change has a big impact. Now, how big that change is, we measured by avoiding emissions from making this compost out of material that was heading to landfills. We see something around the range of 38 tons of applied compost per hectare of avoided emissions. We also see an average of a ton per hectare of sequestered carbon over possibly 30 years. So that it's a formula more than an answer, but clearly the back of the envelope calculations I've done is 2/3 of the available land area treated this way would remove all of the carbon to get us to 350 parts per million. I know that that's a challenging thing, and she's probably shaking her head over here. But it's important for me to know that the thing is within the boundaries of the physical system so that it's even worth pursuing. And as we go further into it, we'll be able to answer that question with a higher resolution.
She's asking for the mic.
I turned it off.
I'm not going to say anything bad. I just wanted to say that this is such a big problem that we're dealing with. So even if we can't solve the entire crisis with this land management strategy, it's such an integral part of our efforts. We need to be looking at, some of the more high-tech in different ways strategies also for dealing with this issue, and it's great to know that we have scientists working on all of those different things. But this is such a straightforward one that has so much to do with the food and the fuel and the fiber that we eat and wear and consume and utilize every day, and so it's a really natural place to put a great deal of investment in. So I think John is pushing in the right direction in his optimism, and I think we have a lot of reason to be optimistic.
Oh, yeah.
I like that.
Maybe this is jumping a little bit ahead, but so our initial research and pushes around compost application, but the results of what we're talking about suggest that these systems, it's not just limited to compost, there's a whole range of potential practices, which is also part of the Marin Carbon Project, and a lot of other folks are doing research on other agricultural practices that have similar carbon benefits. So although it's good to see that compost application, we can actually potentially solve it within the balance of the physical system, there's actually many more potential low-tech practices within the agricultural sector to employ. So where compost may not be appropriate or possible, there are other practices to look at. And we should probably talk about that at some point because it's a much larger universe than compost, but the research using compost opened up and showed us what the soil system could do. It requires more investigation, so that we're also looking at riparian restoration and looking at ranches and farms from a sort of total set of practices. So what's all the potential activities on a ranch or farm that can be employed, and then how do we get landowners to implement those over time? So that's really, fundamentally, the research has led us to more questions and more investigation about how do we get on the ground, which is really the exciting part about the work, I think, is sort of finding expressions like the Fibershed and other systems where we can actually take this information and help inform what folks are doing on the ground relative to carbon and climate, which is the new sort of conversation.
Nicely said. And so one of the projects for 2014 is going to be looking at grazing on its own. And so a lot of discussion has been had in the holistic management world and such around, carbon sequestration can already happen through grazing. Well, that hasn't really been measured, has not been measured. So, you can see above ground biomass increases when you strategically graze your animals, but we haven't measured what's really going through this, what's going on in the soil system to securely say that we could mitigate the climate crisis simply through grazing. That's postulated by some groups, but it hasn't been measured. And that's the beauty of working with the Silver Lab and having gas exchange research as the cornerstone, peer-reviewed, which we'll talk more about too. it's just, it's an amazing amalgam of people coming together to figure this out. So,
I wonder if I could ask you a question.
Sure.
It's really interesting, the point that you made, that there are a variety of different techniques which could be carbon helping. I would love it if you would either refer to some publication or where somebody's laid this out, or just briefly describe the different types of techniques that could be used.
Mr. Creque.
Yeah.
Actually, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, formerly the Soil Conservation Service, has quite a bit of carbon, which you might call carbon farming information on their website. The NRCS has actually identified about 25 standard agricultural conservation practices that they've identified as carbon beneficial. And we've looked at that list and have adopted it for our carbon farm planning process. We've also added a couple of things, compost being one of them. There are practices such as riparian restoration. Pretty obvious when you stop and think about it. But we actually have some quantitative data on that based on 35 years of riparian restoration work that the Marin RCD has done, Resource Conservation District. And UC Extension Marin is in the process of putting that together, and we'll probably be publishing that data pretty soon. Things like cover cropping systems.
Jeff, wouldn't it be a good point to mention the century plan and how there's a sort of building towards a central monitoring and assessment of capacity?
Yeah, there's some pretty powerful models out there, ecosystem carbon models, that have played a role in our work and are being used by the NRCS in the development of their model, which is called Common Farm. So you can actually go online and plug in your farm data, soils and climate information and so forth, and play around with different practices you might want to implement on your farm, and it'll spit out some numbers for you in terms of the carbon benefits of doing that. So there is a lot of information out there. We're looking at things in Marin, for example, in our carbon farm planning process. We're looking at things like windbreaks, improved pasture management, compost applications, riparian restoration,
Grazing management.
Grazing management being a very significant part of our mostly grazed agricultural systems in Marin County and not just so. There was another question.
Thank you. Oh, I was just trying to clarify that was carbon farming, so we said.
Yes, carbon farming, which is not a term that we coined, but we're using it. We're actually moving it to what we're calling our demonstration phase. We're working with 3 ranches in Marin County. We had 12 very viable candidates we wanted to work with, but very limited resources this year, so we started with 3. We're developing full carbon plans for those farms and ranches, basically looking at all the different ways we can enhance their capacity to capture additional carbon through photosynthesis, sequester it in their soils and biomass. And at the end of that process, we hope to have complete carbon plans that we could actually aggregate and take to the carbon market. And maybe Torri wants to talk a little bit about that.
I don't know if we want to go there yet.
We're going to get there.
Okay. Should we mention the 3 farms?
Yeah.
Strauss Family Creamery, the Quarter Ranch, which is outside Petaluma here, and Stemple Creek and Tamales. So those are the 3 systems we're on right now. But an appetite for much more, so we're going to try to reach it.
So the demo sites, you laid the compost out just before the rains were going to fall. So that's the goal, is to apply compost before the rains would hit. So okay, and it was 8 millimeters or ½ an inch.
Well, we could talk about that.
Okay.
We asked the basic question whether management could enhance soil carbon, and it was Jeff's idea to use compost, and the rate of application that he suggested was ½ an inch. And we did ½ an inch because we didn't want to bury the standing grass plants, but we wanted to put enough out that we thought would have an impact. But we'd had an impact, it was great. But the century model suggests that perhaps a ½ inch might also have yielded the same results. So on these large plots now, we've actually split them, and we're comparing ½ inch application to ½ inch application with exclusions in the middle. And so that was very exciting. Now, possibly, we can cut down the quantity of compost in half if the results are what the model suggested would be.
What does that mean, exclusions in the middle?
Oh, so if I do something and I covered this whole floor with wax, and then I told you that you know, this wax is all waterproof now, it might have been waterproof before. So if I leave a patch unwaxed and then pour water on everything and it's all waterproof, then I can't claim that, right? But if I wax around an area and pour water and it soaks through, then the area I've excluded proves that the thing I did was waterproof and had the effect I was looking for. Does that make sense?
So that's like the control.
It's a control, yeah. And so we're excluding. We're still treating, they're still getting the same grazing pressure, or they're seeding through it. So all the other practices are consistent with all of the landscape. But we didn't put compost on 3 exclusions so that we can really see that what we did made a difference.
This is a really silly question, but how can you control a 1/4 inch?
Well, at the scale we're talking about, in a small patch you can use a rake or a measure, but for our purposes, 32 yards spread out over an acre is a 1/4 inch. And so we know how many yards we're spreading, and if it's really bad, we'll rake it to average it. But it's an average over a large landscape. And you know, the soil is a very interesting mix of conditions. Did you want to?
That's also why we need to take so many soil samples, so that when we get our results in the lab and the sample size is large enough to really know what the effect would be in that average sense.
Thank you. There's a question.
Do we know whether perennial plant systems versus annual plant systems have an effect on how much carbon is sequestered? I work in the landscape industry, so we're primarily perennial plant systems, and when you add up how many acres we actually affect, it's quite substantial. And I'm curious as to that.
It's you.
It's good deal.
I think the short answer is probably that perennial grasses particularly do a great job putting a lot of their biomass below ground. And annual grasses do that too, but in fact perennials tend to have much more extensive root systems than annuals. So we're operating under the assumption, and there is some data to support this, and Marcia might want to speak to this, but yeah, perennials are probably, at least in our grazed rangeland systems, probably better at sequestering carbon below ground, and probably true in landscape systems as well.
Is it important that they're continually mowed down by cattle, and that's part of the reason it's
Well, not continually mowed down,
but repeatedly?
but
Strategically?
strategically. Yeah, and that really goes back to the research that Rebecca mentioned, that we have a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that strategic grazing can result in soil carbon increases. And there is actually some published data suggesting that improved grazing, however that may be defined, improved grazing practices can lead to increased carbon sequestration in soils. There's a gaping hole in the rangeland literature around this question, and there's a lot of interest right now in trying to fill that, including in Wick's lab. So that's something we're going to be looking at in the next coming years.
Could one extrapolate that a winter dormant plant that's going to get cut down might sequester more than an evergreen, or is that too far of a leap?
Yeah, I think that's probably a stretch.
Sure. I'll just add that for what we do know about grazing isn't well integrated with what we know about the perennial versus annual plants. So those are separate things that when we investigate grazing might be of interest to think about whether those are annual or perennial plants. But to date, we don't know. And then there is some evidence, as Jeff was mentioning, in the scientific literature that pretty strongly suggests that lands that we have, especially in California here, that used to be perennial and now are annual might still be losing carbon because of that switch. And that might be what happened on our own study site as well. We have some evidence from the Century model, which is a model we keep mentioning, which is a really commonly used and well-tested biogeochemical model that looks at processes. And we use it to look at carbon storage changes and greenhouse gas emissions over long time periods. But yeah, so there is evidence that switch has led to changes in soil carbon, but that doesn't mean that the annual plants that we have, and that we have so many of that dominate our grasslands, can't be utilized to increase soil carbon in those soils. And it's very difficult to move back to perennial systems, and we have so many annual grasslands, so that's where our focus has been in this project. Okay.
Are there any other questions related to that? Because I'm going to go with the next.
Yes,
oh, yes.
I don't know if it's related, but does land rest play any role, like not using?
So does land rest play any role in the model to perhaps maybe sequester CO2 through grazing and?
Yes.
Yeah, if you think about it, you know, a plant, in order to photosynthesize, it has to be able to have some green leaf area and absorb sunlight and CO2. And if it's being constantly grazed or mown or tilled, it's not going to be able to do that. So, sort of basic grazing theory is that we want to graze the plant and then allow time of recovery, where it's not being grazed, where it can grow and photosynthesize and store some carbon in its roots and in its crown, and be ready, prepare itself essentially for the next grazing event. So yes, rest is definitely part of the picture.
But too much rest is a problem.
Well, that's really where the research is going to go, I think, is looking at what is the temporal scale, the spatial scale of a grazing event that can actually add carbon to the system versus removing carbon from the system. So I think we're talking about how many animals for how long and how big an area, how much of the plant do they remove, and then how long does that plant have to recover before it gets hit again? Those are the kinds of things we'll be looking at.
So the other question is about the cover crops. What is a good cover crop?
Well, that would depend on your farming system.
Well, I just have
So,
a couple of chickens.
cover crops are usually in an arable system, right?
So yeah, John makes a point that cover crops are typically associated with tilled systems, with arable cropping systems, or possibly no-till farming systems as well. And our data, our research has not looked at arable systems. There is some research out there in arable systems, and personally, based on my farming experience, I think arable systems have a lot of potential to sequester carbon, even with tillage. But we haven't looked at that question, and so there is some data out there, but it's not from our work.
We are very interested in understanding carbon sequestration on tilled landscapes as well as from a fiber perspective, whether we're looking at the reintroduction of industrial hemp, which we are looking at in Colorado this coming spring, and Marcia and Wendy and a grad student will be coming out to Colorado to do some gas extraction soil sampling on the first industrial hemp seed trial in North America. So we are going to see how the carbon impact of tillage for fiber crops. We'll get a first-hand account of that soon. But the question from the public here is, Jeff, you've been called Jeff Chef. I didn't realize this. But
a lot of things.
Jeff the chef has created this compost recipe, and not all composts are alike, I guess. And so I'm interested in, do you have, the question is, what's your recipe?
I thought Jeff was going to start a show on cable.
Iron Chef, Iron Jeff.
Right.
Sorry, Jeff.
I actually, I knew this question was coming. And actually the answer to that is use what you have. Because fundamentally compost is an on-farm, it should be an on-farm process, which means that what you have on your farm should dictate what's going into your compost pile. There are some fundamental pieces to composting that are sort of given that are essential. You've got to get your carbon-nitrogen ratio right, but there's a range. There's room to play around with that. You've got to get your moisture right and your air right. Earth, air, fire, water. That's what we're talking about. Getting that mix right means you can make good compost, but you can make good compost out of just about anything. And if you're farming, anything you might consider a residue or a waste product of your farming process can be incorporated into your compost pile. And the more compost you make, the more compost you're going to produce, the more biomass you're going to have available to make compost. So it's one of these beautiful upward spiraling systems where the more you have, just as we saw in the compost treated plots, where by adding some carbon to the system, we got some more carbon. If you were farming that system, you could be harvesting that carbon, integrating it into your compost. Alan Chadwick, who some of you are probably familiar with, used to say that 1/2 to 2/3 of the area of your farm or garden should be devoted to production of biomass for compost production.
Wow.
That sounds like a lot, but when you actually start doing that, and you take that seriously, suddenly you begin to realize that actually you can do that. You can do that, and as you do that, your production increases. So it gets easier and easier to do. You start looking around for where am I going to, you start with nothing, you start with, maybe you'll get a wheelbarrow load of stuff, and then next year you got 5 wheelbarrow loads of stuff, and the next year you got 20 wheelbarrow loads of stuff, and pretty soon you've got biomass coming out your ears. And it comes down to thinking about carbon all the time as you're farming. All the ways you can sequester carbon, capture carbon, hold carbon in your system. Simple example, stop pulling your weeds, right? Because your roots, that whole rhizosphere, that intensely active biological system around the plant root is where it's all happening. And if you pull that weed, so-called, out of the ground, with it you pull that incredibly dynamic system. And what do you do with it? You throw it on the garden path and send it all back into the atmosphere? It's insane, right? Even if you put it on a compost pile, you've lost that dynamic living piece of your soil. So if you stop pulling your weeds and you just cut them off below the crown with a knife, and leave all that active biomass in the ground, you've captured more carbon, you've sequestered more carbon than you were doing the day before when you were pulling it. So you start thinking about your farm or garden from a carbon perspective. You put carbon at the heart, at the center of everything you're doing on the land, and all of a sudden it all starts to make sense. Everything falls into place, and you've got plenty of compost to go along with.
And do you season with thyme?
And you definitely season with thyme. That's a good point. Composting, as John is fond of pointing out, does not happen naturally necessarily. I mean, you go out and you find a wood rat pile in the woods, and you say, this looks like a compost pile, and it might even be warm in there, but it's not going to be a hot pile because wood rat doesn't want to live at 131 degrees Fahrenheit. But when we build compost piles, and when we get it right, air, water, earth, fire, we get that balance right, the pile fires off when we get up to temperatures, usually typical with 140, 150, 160 degrees. And that doesn't happen naturally in our most of our systems. So those bacteria that are working that are some of the oldest forms of life on the planet. And we can actually manage them, and they're everywhere. And we can manage them to our benefit. And that's what's kind of cool about the whole compost ecosystem phenomenon.
Yeah. Thank you so much, because that answers one of the worries I had, which is, from an outsider's perspective, looking at how you could jumpstart the system with compost. My first question is, how much is this going to cost? And obviously farmers are going to ask that question. So what you're talking about is the endogenous enwrapment of that within your carbon cycle as a total. That's a process, whereas if you want to jumpstart it, somebody was talking at the previous discussion that I was attending about towns like San Francisco who are actually taking food scraps and generating compost. So you use the cities to generate some of the compost because we're facing a situation where the need to rapidly be able to scale this up very fast, up several orders of magnitude, makes it really important to cut some corners, even though what you're saying is an exponential process over the long run. Right. I wonder if, I'm sure you guys have thought about that. I would really love to hear your thoughts about the economics of how to jumpstart it to give this model a sort of start in life.
And that would lead to the question that we actually got from the community at this point, which is, where's the state protocol at? Because some of this isn't going to just happen from the bank accounts of the ranchers and farmers and the land managers directly. For some it may, but for many it will not. And you're right, magnitude of scale and such, it needs to happen fast, especially after if anyone read Darjamal's latest article on the methane permafrost release and the Arctic being ice-free by 2016 by Navy researchers. Planetary crisis, so here we go. How are we going to make this affordable and go fast?
So one of the premises of the Marin Carbon Project was to do this founding research to see if we could measure the carbon as a way to potentially connect agriculture to climate. So the advantage we have in California is a fairly strong set of policies mandating carbon reductions, and I think there are going to be many potential financing mechanisms. The one that's in front of us now is the carbon market. So, sort of related to the question, we wanted to develop the science and monitoring and measurement to be able to give a farmer or rancher the ability to start a practice and be able to measure it and say you actually increase carbon. And our hope over time was that they'll be able to sell those carbon increases on the carbon market. So you ask about how we're going to finance this, so that's our sort of plan A. So to connect these practices, get it validated with research, and we develop a protocol, and essentially a protocol, we talk a lot about market protocols, but essentially a protocol for us is just a recipe. Jeff talks about it. So if you're asking them to do a practice, it's sort of like make a cake. It's sort of like we have to give people these steps of how you do it, how you measure it over time, so that we know that the carbon increases are real. So what we're doing as part of our major effort, working with Silver Lab and Environmental Defense Fund, is actually taking this protocol to various levels. So we've taken the protocol to the American Carbon Registry, which is a voluntary registry that takes climate protocols and basically reviews them for use on the voluntary market. So if there's a polluter or somebody looking for carbon reductions, like Walmart has their own goal about reducing carbon, and they can't do it in their own operations, they can go onto the voluntary market, buy those right now probably around $10 to $15 a ton. So a farmer potentially could be selling those on the carbon market. Our hope at some point is not because the protocol isn't valid, it's just that the state of California is looking at scores of protocols, and unfortunately, protocols coming out of agriculture are probably on the plan B list for them, probably 2 years out, just because they're backlogged looking at protocols. But our hope in 2 years is that we'll have a protocol for this practice, and hopefully many others coming behind it that are validated through research that could actually be in the regulatory market, which we're hoping by 2 or 3 years will be sort of north of $20 a ton for carbon. At that price, at $20 a ton, that pays for half the cost of our practice now. So we're also looking at other revenue in the region. The counties are, like Sonoma County has a climate action plan with goals for carbon reduction, and a lot of ways through which projects are financed are through CEQA. So when there's a project developer in the county who exceeds 1,500 tons of carbon through a project like the hospital expansion in Santa Rosa, the hospital couldn't offset all their greenhouse gases that they were going to generate from expanding their operations. So when the county wrote the permit, they said, okay, you're going to exceed 1,500 tons a year, tell us how you're going to mitigate those. They couldn't mitigate it all on site, so they have to go off-site, and actually the county has a list of practices and projects that essentially the developer has to pay for to do off-site. So actually we're now in conversation with a regional air district who's the leading body who essentially approves those kind of practices. We're actually putting the compost practices and hoping other practices onto that CEQA list so that local counties like Marin who want to support agricultural-based strategies can actually use CEQA as another revenue stream. So And the one thing we have to realize too is that through NRCS and there is already funding sources for conservation practices on farms. So EQIP funding, there is some state funding. So we're not really different than many other climate sectors. For energy efficiency, there's usually 3 or 4 or 5 different pieces of revenue that somebody who's coming to do either solar in your house or put windows in has to collect together to make the project viable. Agriculture is no different. Until the market gets up to $40 a ton or $25 a ton, we're going to have to be a bit nimble about bringing different resources in. So where a farmer can do carbon sequestration and also get water quality benefit, there may be public funds to do that. Bring in CEQA, hopefully bring in the voluntary market. So we're sort of building this up. And there is a real tension around how quickly we can do that from where we're starting. But we're certainly pushing the envelope. AB 32, the state law, did not include agricultural practices as part of the solution set. I can tell you right now, agriculture will be on the table for AB 32, but the biggest challenge is that many of the agencies that are working in agriculture have not been part of pushing out programs to farmers and ranchers to bring these practices. So it's not only funding, it's also agencies having the mandate to develop the technical assistance to work with farmers to do carbon farming plans, so we have plans, having the technical assistance and the financing together. So what I expect we'll see is existing federal and state programs and local efforts like ours, the Marin Carbon Project, sort of coming together to make this happen, largely on initially a demonstration level, much like any other sector, building that expertise, building that credibility, and then trying to scale the effort further out. But the one thing we do have, which is a big boon for us, is having the science behind this and taking the time to step through that. So a long-winded answer to your question, but we're trying to build it. We're working with many other people to build it. Having demand from the public and from farmers in the ag community wanting this is going to help move this quicker. That's just the way it works. So, can the general public do something to help? Yeah. I think there are several opportunities. One, the protocol that we've written for compost application in rangeland is going to the Marin Carbon Registry. There will be a public comment period. And I know many public comment periods are not that sort of, glamorous or things to do, but it's actually really important, I think, for ACR to hear not only from the public, but from producers or people in the agricultural community about why this practice is important and how impactful it could be for Fibershed or any other related things. So they need to hear not only from the technical folks, but from the public that you want to see these kind of practices going through. There will be some legislation this year, next year, around investment of climate funding for agriculture. So as we build out our ability to work with ourselves and partners to talk to our representatives at a local level or at the state level, sort of thinking about the budget when we're in surplus now, some of those funding going to agriculture for climate, there definitely will be a direct connection to get people involved with your local representatives saying, please support legislation that's putting some of this money into the agricultural sector for this kind of practice. So there's definitely going to be a lot of opportunities. The one opportunity in Sonoma County, since we're here, that I hope we'll be able to do, Sonoma's rewriting its climate action plan. Our hope is that a significant piece of that plan will be focused on this potential of agriculture. So right now the county's going around to most of the towns and having a conversation around climate. We're having some meetings with them. I'm hoping we actually can, in those meetings, bring up this conversation around the role of agriculture and working lands in that, because I think they need to hear agriculture has not really been on the table for the county, but there's a really big opportunity in the Sonoma's next round of innovation. We've done a lot of great work on energy, community choice aggregation and the residential program, but I think there's a lot of potential for working lands in agriculture, and I think the county needs to hear from that. And I think the challenge is that most of the climate leaders in this community are really focused on mitigation through energy and other things, which is really important. They need to hear from folks working in the sector about what these strategies can do, and that's part of the planning process, is for them to hear that and then go back and do the hard work. Okay, what is the potential in Sonoma? What are the financial mechanisms we can pull in place, and what's the scale we can get to in Sonoma in the next 3 years? And that's the conversation we want to have in Sonoma, and it's right here. And the RCPA is going to every town. Every town's going to have, hopefully, a climate action plan. The question is, what's the role of working lands and agriculture in that? It's right here in front of us. So.
Can you distinguish between mitigation and solution? Okay.
So one of our challenges going to Sacramento, talking to the different agencies, and they're all very excited to meet with us, and we've had tremendous access to even the governor's task force on climate and agriculture. The challenge is all of their conversations and all of their strategies are about emission reductions. And then we're going up there talking about removing carbon from the atmosphere and putting it to beneficial use in our food-producing soil systems. They don't have a form to fit our conversation. It's a challenge for them. They get it, they like it, but it's a struggle because we're proposing a solution rather than limiting or minimizing the damage. It's a complete paradigm shift, and that's a challenge.
So who should these folks talk to if you're, raise your hand if you live in Sonoma County? Is there a mechanism that Fibershed could support on our website or social media to engage these folks in phone calls at the right time, right place?
There's a hand.
Oh, yes.
Well, I just wanted to say that I'm part of the Community Alliance for Family Farmers, and we're the climate action group, and going to those community meetings that you were referring to, Torri, is helpful because they really do want to hear from us. It was a small group in Santa Rosa, like 40 of us in total. And so we had lots of time to be able to talk to them, and so obviously the CAP group is talking about agricultural and specifically your project and so forth. So they really do want to hear from us. They really are, you know, like whatever you guys put forth is what we're going to be looking at in terms of our climate action plan. So thanks for going on these community meetings. It really is important.
And the next meeting would be, and then Julian will take your question.
Oh, boy, good question. I don't know. I went to the Santa Rosa one this week, but they're happening right now. RCPA would be a good place to look.
We could put that on your website, right?
Yeah, we can put this on the Fibershed website. So it's RCPA for this region here, and that would be the place to look for the next meeting to bring your understanding of, as John likes to say, you're all going to become carbon cycle managers, each one of you, by the choices of what you put in your mouth and on your body and how you get around town, and you're managing carbon, whether you're on a farm or not.
The other opportunity is that the county's actually done a really good job. It actually has $1 million to do this planning effort. So there is a stakeholder advisory group that actually agriculture is represented with citizens. So as the plans get developed, that body will have a number of meetings to look at what the county's come up with. And I think those will be opportunities too to engage. And I generally feel that RCPA, as the sort of lead climate agency in the county, is really open to have this kind of dialogue. So I think those are actually really, a lot of people might go to land use planning and other meetings and probably feel they're not being heard, but I actually think RCPA really wants to hear innovative ideas and really, they have $1 million to assess some of these strategies out. So I think there's a really big opportunity to inform them and help them guide through. And there are some people in the stakeholder group that know about this work and want to see it succeed. So supporting them to take the leadership role that Sonoma's already taken is a really important, I think, piece of our responsibility is to be out there and supporting them.
And so I'm going to get back to some of the policy pieces in a moment, but a lot of the policy that we want to see to enable on-the-ground change, to make it affordable and accessible, it's all backed, all these discussions are backed by peer-reviewed science. And a question came in, what does peer review really mean? What does that look like? And then the second part of that was, what does it mean that Fibershed is using peer-reviewed scientific research on the gas exchange for gas exchange and carbon data? And so, Marcia, can you speak to...
Well, I'd rather take that. Just kidding.
Would you like to comment first, John?
No, it's good.
Okay.
But I'll have a second.
Absolutely. So peer-reviewed science is so important in our field as a science community, and that's what basically our way of rigorously quality controlling the work that we do as scientists as a larger community. So that's our gold standard for the work that we do, and once something has passed through peer review process and been published, that's when we feel like we have the go-ahead to say, you know, this is really powerful science. We can say strong things about this work to move forward policy and other work within the community. And the way that peer-reviewed science works is we do all this research and all these analysis and rigorous statistics, and we put together our best work, and then we submit it to a journal that we think is very relevant to the work that we've done. That work then gets passed on to an editor. The editor is an expert within that field, and then they will choose 2 to 3, sometimes more, scientists within the community who are well established in the fields that are of interest in that paper. And those scientists will then critically read the paper anonymously on their own time and look at things considering the experimental design, all of the results and interpretation and analysis, and then we'll write back critical feedback and suggest to the editor whether or not that paper should be accepted as it is, whether it should undergo minor or major revisions, or if it should be rejected. So once the editor has received all the feedback from the different reviewers, they'll then give it back. They'll make a decision about what will happen next with that paper, send it back to the scientist, and the scientist is then our job to address all of the concerns of all of the reviewers and the editor who are the leaders in those different fields that the paper touches on. And so once we've done that, if we've satisfied all of the reviewers, it's oftentimes sent back to them, it's sent back to the editor. If we've satisfied them, then the paper is put into press, and we make the minor editorial changes and make it look pretty, and then it goes into the science journals, which are then taken in by the media, and then you learn a story kind of along that part of the pathway. But there's a lot that goes into the paper just to try to make sure that the science is of the utmost quality before you see anything in the news about it. So that's the process that we do. The problem is it takes a really long time because pass it back and forth between scientists, and changes need to be made, and oftentimes you need to do additional experiments or testing. But that's when we feel really confident that we've done a good job and that we can move these things forward. So that's what we've been doing with our Marin Carbon Project, and we're very, very proud of that work. We've used peer-reviewed research for the Fibershed life cycle assessment. By that, we mean that we go to the peer-reviewed sources first, so the journal articles that are in high-quality, peer-reviewed journals and articles to look to see what data is out there. And then we use that data and that information from which to build this framework to think about what are the agricultural practices that have gone into producing the fibers, what do we know about them, what are the greenhouse gas dynamics, what's happening with the soils, what's happening on the different parts of the production line. So we start there, we use our best knowledge, the best science that's out there, and then fill in the gaps with the best guesses and be very, based on all of the knowledge that we have, and be very clear about those limits of the study.
Excellent.
Can I just take a quick follow-up? So the research that Fibershed uses is peer-reviewed, and the Marin Carbon cycle is in the process of getting the research peer-reviewed?
Much of the research that we've done is already peer-reviewed. There are many more papers coming out in different stages of that. So a lot of the findings from the first field experiment that was done on John's ranch and in the Sierra foothills, as you've heard, there are several papers already that are peer-reviewed publications that are available to anyone who'd like to see them. Also the survey, the literature survey from California, that was the first paper that came out that we use as the basis for the study. That's peer-reviewed and published. The life cycle assessment is peer-reviewed and published, and we have several more coming down the line. The Fibershed is not peer-reviewed yet. This is
preliminary.
Very preliminary, yes, which Rebecca's done a great job of expressing when she shows it. This is in its initial stages. So what this is just the development of a framework for a life cycle assessment for Fibershed using the best information that we have available, but there's a lot left to do. In particular, spreading it, the analysis to include cotton, which we haven't done yet, and then getting it written up into that paper form, and we'll start the peer review process.
Great, thank you.
And so Marcia, do you want to just speak to this piece here is the optimistic protocol, if we were to have an optimistic protocol adopted by the state of California for compost on rangelands? Yeah, and these rangelands would be grazed by sheep, which are fiber producers. And then this material would go through.
Microphone?
Oh. I'm just verifying the different pieces, and you can comment on them. But the most extreme 2 bars on this is Marcia's preliminary research, and this is on wool material, wool cloth. And so this is conventional production. This is CO2e is basically carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas equivalent. So we know that kilograms, it's 2.2 pounds. Is that correct? Approximately. So you could just say, if you want to equate, a wool garment, conventionally produced, probably from New Zealand wools, going through traditional supply chains in Asia, coming and being imported and then worn by someone in the United States. Just your one garment, your smart wool base layer, is going to put close to 70 some odd pounds of carbon, CO2e, carbon and greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere.
Does that include laundry and the use of it after you purchase it?
Thank you. And there's some end-wear use, and I'll actually just let you follow up with this, because end-wear use included cold wash, I believe, and air dry. But then this over here is just best case scenario, and I'll let you explain best case scenario.
Sure. Okay. So this is just a wide range of hypothetical situations, trying to encompass everything that's involved, from the land management and the animals and their emissions. So the CO2 equivalence is, in this case, and usually when you hear about them, if you hear about them in the media or the literature, methane and nitrous oxide and CO2. But methane and nitrous oxide, while usually emitted in much smaller quantities by animals or after fertilizer application or from combustion of fossil fuels, vehicles and transportation, and all these things, are so much more powerful of greenhouse gases. So it's really important that we consider them also when we try to do an analysis like this, and think from the very big picture perspective of what is the impact that we're having on our atmosphere. So the very optimistic, lovely gray bar there is representing a scenario in which we have animals grazed at what we think are reasonable or optimal stocking rates, so that there's not soil carbon degradation, you're not doing anything negative to your land. We also considered the possible benefit from adding compost based on our own studies of compost addition to rangelands, and all of the benefits you have from diverting that material from really high emission waste streams that you use for your compost. So if you hadn't captured that material and put it into the compost, which can then help the soil, maybe that material went into a landfill and created a lot of methane, and therefore was a big methane source in our atmosphere regionally and globally. And the same thing with manure that might have been used for that compost, and if that had gone to a very high emission, low oxygen manure management system. So waste diversion, healthy soils, good stocking rates, renewable energy sources being used, minimal transportation, good consumer care on the end, and all of these different things that you can think about with the, sort of the ideal garment and how you would produce it from the land base all the way through when it was worn and taken care of. Did I cover everything?
Yeah. It's a new ethic.
And so you can see that if all of us in our room counted up the amount of, if we were all counting up our long sleeve shirts, and let's just say they were all natural fiber, they're all wool, And you could see the impact we could have on atmospheric emissions just by making choices that were honoring soil-to-soil processes, which was the last slide. And we hope to make this a reality, and that's really why we're working so closely as kind of as a team with all these different skills to really change this material culture narrative from policy to science to
practice.
To practice, yeah, put this into practice so you're eating and wearing it. And I think I'd like to take a couple of questions from the audience. We also have a mention of, Ellen, do you want to mention the CAF, Community Alliance for Family Farmers compost workshop?
Biochar, yeah, it's a...
Oh, it's biochar. We have to talk about biochar too up here. That's another thing we're going to address.
Well, CAF is doing a series of events this year. That's again the Community Alliance for Family Farmers in Sonoma County and Mendocino, or everywhere here. But and our first of the series is to do this, what's called a conservation burn, to help vineyards and farmers with, every year they have to do some kind of a burn on their farms, you know, whatever their vineyards or whatever they're burning. And so in this case, it's going to be showing them how to do it by basically burning from the top down. And by doing that, they are reducing their greenhouse gas emissions significantly. And in that process are also creating biochar. And so that's, we're calling it the biochar event, but really it's a conservation burn. And that's on February 14th. And it's going to be held at Schoen Farm. There are only 33 seats, and I think we've got like 8 or 9 of them left. And we are trying to make it mostly for farmers. But it is on our site, on the CAF.org website, if anybody's interested, or you can talk to me later.
Okay. So we also had a couple of questions about biochar in general, because it's a different practice than making compost, as per the chef recipe that we heard earlier. And so we had 2 questions around biochar, and Dustin has a more specific, detailed question about it, but really the general sense is, have we thought about biochar and what are the issues around it? And this other question came in from the live feed. It's my understanding that biochar creates recalcitrant carbon, which stays tied up in the soil for centuries rather than off-gassing into the atmosphere on a shorter cycle. Is this true? And could this help? So maybe a description of biochar, and then some of the issues around its full life cycle assessment could be brought up.
Biochar, I think, has a place in the climate change equation, but I think that it has been oversold. There are a lot of issues around biochar, particularly with respect to life cycle analysis, as Marcia's touched on with the Fibershed work. Not all biochar is created equal, and it is not all recalcitrant. In fact, there's some evidence that in some cases biochar can actually stimulate the loss of soil carbon. There was an interesting review done recently by Noel Gurich. Basically went through all of the biochar literature, peer-reviewed literature. There's a lot of great literature on biochar that expounds upon its virtues. When you get into the peer-reviewed literature, it's very ambiguous. And in fact, there's very little evidence to support many of the claims that have been made around biochar. And the problem really comes down, I think, to a life cycle assessment and the lack of thereof in most of the biochar reporting that's out there. I went to the biochar conference in Sonoma 2 years ago, and there was one mention in the 3-day conference, there was one mention of life cycle assessment. So it's very exciting to think that careful burning could lead to the production of long-term carbon, recalcitrant carbon. And I have no doubt that in some cases that's true. And I think that if biomass is being burned for some legitimate reason, and biochar is a byproduct of that, it makes sense to introduce that to the soil system.
After a full life cycle assessment.
Well, even without it, in the sense that if you're producing it as a function of something else you're doing, it may make sense to take that waste char, if you will, and incorporate it into your soil system. But without addressing the life cycle question, you really can't make claims about the greenhouse gas implications of biochar use and production. And again, as someone who, cooked and heated my water and heated my house with wood for 25 years, I produced a lot of biochar, not in the best way, but it was a byproduct of combustion. I incorporated that into my soil system. I saw clear benefits from that. But I have no idea what the relative greenhouse gas impacts of burning that stuff were. So I personally really do believe there's a place for biochar in this equation, but I do not think it is a given that biochar is a net greenhouse gas benefit. It is true that many farming systems employ fire, and vineyards are among those that regularly burn their waste products, allegedly for disease control purposes. I would argue that without life cycle assessment, I would be much more inclined to run that stuff through a chipper and make compost of it. But that's my bias, clearly. So I would caution everyone who's involved with biochar to really ask themselves some hard questions about it. But I would also be very interested in attending that workshop, because I think, as I said, I think there's a place for this. And if you're going to burn, it makes sense to do it in a way that minimizes the greenhouse gas impacts of burning, and then utilize that carbon in your soil system.
May I just add to that quickly and say that I agree with everything that Jeff just said from my recent review of the literature also. But also just re-emphasize that like LCA's life cycle assessments are needed for biochar and for all the different biochars that are produced, we also need to continue doing them for compost or other amendments that we would add to the soil. So this is part of something we want to do with everything that we're adding all the time. And so we're advocating that for biochar as well. And I also found it interesting reviewing the literature myself that we actually know very little about how much methane and nitrous oxide is released from burning of biomass. It is quite surprising, and especially in rangeland systems and cropland systems. So when you go back and you look, and like I mentioned before, they are very small amounts, but they are very powerful greenhouse gases. So looking and to see when that research comes out and to be aware and push for that research of also knowing what is being emitted on additional aerosols also, which contribute to the greenhouse gas effect. That we should just be aware that those are big pieces of the biochar life cycle assessment that have very large question marks in them.
And I just have a question. On a planet that's heating up, is burning things our best strategy?
It's possible. I'm not going to. That would compost.
And so how many of you are landowners of, I would say, scale over 5 acres? Land managers. Yeah, let's just say management, not necessarily ownership. Okay. So I guess this question will pertain to a lot of you, which is how can non-landowners and small land holding managers, garden scale peoples, help to make this happen? And we've heard about getting engaged in policy, and just to reiterate, we've heard about not pulling weeds, which I think is brilliant, cutting them from the top and the crown. Are there other additions other than getting on the phone and talking to policymakers? What can we do?
So as I introduced myself, I'm actually paying attention to every drop of water that lands on my land right now. And there are 4 possible outcomes for each of those drops. 2 of them are bad. One of those is that it would evaporate, which is a wasted opportunity. The other is it would move away, carrying with it my soil or my nutrients. But the 2 good ways are that it go into the carbon-rich soil and make its way slowly over time to recharge our aquifers, or transpire up through a plant performing photosynthesis. So it's my job as a land manager to make sure I never have bare soil, And I personally don't till ever anymore. I used to plow and do things like that, and I rather enjoyed it, but I've given it up. And so I compost every possible thing. Anything that was ever alive can be composted. And there's a whole other project that we're involved with, the Thermopile project, where we've composted human waste now. And there's John Hulse is in the audience here.
They make you sit at the back.
Oh, we've got them bracketed, don't worry. But so as a land manager, I'm making effective use of every drop of water. I'm making sure there's never any bare soil. And anything that was ever alive, I try and compost it. So if you visit, just heads up.
I was just going to say that, kind of confirming what John just said also, compost what you can. We are throwing something like 50% of our organic materials into our landfills, and it is so distressing because those are resources. That's very valuable nutrient resources that we could be using in a better way. And we need to support these composting programs that are growing in the Bay Area so that when other places look to us for as an example, that these are programs that are successful, that people are participating in, that people appreciate. And don't let anyone throw plastic into the compost bin. Right. I know none of you would. But it's such a distraction for people making compost. And I was shocked myself when I went to a compost facility and saw the amount of plastic waste that was in those piles and the effort that they needed to put into trying to take that out. So that includes, in many cases, be aware of your compost program, because that also includes compostable plastics in some cases that are contaminating the compost that people are trying to produce from green waste and in food waste in these areas. So that's that's something that I feel like also I find myself talking about at dinner conversations with people when I tell them what I do or what I've been doing recently, which oftentimes involves compost, and I just take the opportunity to tell them about the value of our compost programs and how lucky we are to have these and how much we need to protect those programs and help them move forward.
I'm going to tag.
So in terms of the acceptable level of plastic in OMRI certified compost, I thought 1% that seemed acceptable. But when I'm spreading acres of compost, that means every 100 square feet, there's a square foot of plastic sitting there. And so as we were picking all the plastic out of the research plots that came home, it's really nasty. So no plastic in compost.
I just want to say that Sonoma Compost takes yard trimmings and vegetables now. So you can put your veggie scraps in the green bin, and they will take it to Sonoma Compost. Yeah.
Can you talk about clopyralid?
Yeah, paper towels, paper plates, you know.
We've also found stickers from fruit on just so you know, they're okay, but
there's something like 30 million tons of organics being disposed of improperly in California annually, and that would make enough compost to cover about 6% of the state's rangelands on an ongoing annual basis. So that would be a huge impact in California's greenhouse gases. It would basically offset all the energy use of the commercial sector in the state. So we're really talking about very significant potential by capturing what is currently being thrown away and generating methane in landfills and throughout the state. So this is not a trivial question at all.
And then bioaccumulation.
Are you proposing that we change that, or that he's doing that?
It's really going to take everybody demanding this.
Because we've had talks here about the chickens and how chicken tractors or steer tractors fix all that. But I live in England, and it's a village, and we have 3 waste management trucks come every Tuesday on our little tiny road, and they make a turn up one side of it to pick up the bins, and then they go all the way up the other side. And even just putting bins on one side of the road and having them only have to go by one time would be a big help, but nobody seems to think that's viable.
You just volunteered.
Yeah. I'm not even a U.S. citizen, so that's
Do you want to talk about bioaccumulating clopyralid?
Oh, God. Yeah, There are several herbicides on the market now that are known to, well, first of all, I should start with good news. There are a lot of herbicides, pesticides, pharmaceuticals and so forth that have been shown to be destroyed in the compost environment. So that's good news, including dioxin, by the way. However, there are some compounds that have been recently developed in the last decade or so, herbicides that do not break down in the compost environment. Because they don't break down, they essentially accumulate and actually concentrate in the compost environment. So a few years ago, it showed up in Washington State, compost, and people were putting compost in their gardens and watching their vegetables die. So it's a concern. These herbicides tend to be used in many cases on rangelands to control thistles, for example. They end up in livestock feed through hay, and then that can go right through the animal, including horses, and end up in manure, and manure gets composted, and voila, you have an herbicidal compost. So all of us in the compost industry are left basically having to test our compost for residual herbicides. And it's fairly easily done with bioassays where we can seed a flat of rockhead or something quick growing like that into our compost and then see how it grows. And if it doesn't keel over dead in a few weeks, we're fairly confident that it's safe to use. But it has really complicated our lives, and it's hard not to think of it sometimes as a conspiracy on the part of the agrochemical companies. But I try not to do it. And again, it's one of those things where public pressure, the U.S. Compost Council is very active in trying to make these herbicides illegal or very limited use. It's just one of those ongoing, recurrent problems that we have in trying to make rational decisions in the way we manage our lives and our planet and our resources.
I just want to make a plug. I mean, you asked what people can do, and it's kind of, it's not strange being up here, but the story that we usually tell, which is John's story, was this inquiry into how he can manage his ranch differently. So I think the revolutionary act, the important act, is that you come here to educate yourself. So stay tuned to the website, support Fibershed, support the Marin Carbon Project, support your local farmer. But I do want to say, the research itself and the implications for the soil system, we haven't even scratched the surface, I think, of what we might see coming up. So continue to educate yourself. That's the first act. Second, talk to your neighbors. And then find the local project or develop the one that you think has a potential, and start asking some questions about how to validate it, because that's how all this started. So we have some expertise up here in a very important but small piece of the soil system and a small piece of agriculture, so there's a lot more work to do. I don't say that to dishearten people. I'm actually saying it as this could be fun. This is the work that we need to do, and small actions make a huge difference. All the innovation I've seen in climate change, Sonoma's energy efficiency program, was 6 people sitting in a room up in Santa Rosa trying to figure out how to put on energy efficiency. It took up 6 months, and a lot of beer and pizza and spreadsheets, but this is how things are going to change, and I think that's always been the case. So you have some outlets here with Fibershed and Marin Carbon Project, but there are other organizations working on this, so get plugged in, figure out how this can be a benefit to the communities, either geographically or that you're involved in professionally or hobby. Like, ask the carbon question and innovate yourself, and if you have a good idea, let us know. We'll try to help you as much as we can.
Well said. So we're going to take some questions so we can keep the educational piece rolling here.
My question is, since you work in Marin, have you contacted Patty Garbarino? I mean, I feel like part of what we need is more education in terms of how we compost. I mean, you're right, the little stickers off your bananas and stuff. I mean, I think people need to know more, and she loves being an advocate. So I just wanted to mention that.
Can you clarify who she is?
Marin Sanitary, the family owns Marin Sanitary. And I know there's other refuse companies in Marin County. I don't know who they are, but I actually, Sausalito's Bay Cities, which goes all the way to Richmond, they come all the way from Richmond, which is ridiculous. And I don't think they have a very good program at all. Our business is picked up by them, and it's horrible.
Actually, we have talked with Patty Garbarino, and we'll be in conversation with her going forward as well. So yeah, we're starting to talk to the broader compost industry about this.
Actually, you're doing a presentation.
Yeah, we're going to be presenting at the U.S. Composting Council in a week or so over in Oakland. But there's really good news about that conversation with Patty Garbarino. Our local, or the state level, the Cal Recycle agent has been encouraging and brokering that conversation. So we're getting tremendous support from the state to have these conversations that you're proposing. So it's a very great time for this to be happening.
Yeah, I don't know if you know, there's a new law, relatively new law. We had very strong source reduction, waste reduction law in California that required all cities and counties to reduce their waste by 75% in a very short amount of time. So the remaining increment of waste going to landfill largely is organics. Cal Recycle has a new legislation requiring organics to be taken out of the waste stream, which can be done. There's, as we talked about, a lot of complications with that, but the Cal Recycle actually, as the lead agency implementing that at the county level, is really interested in this issue of organics, how we take it out of the waste stream, compost it, and then the question becomes, where does that go? So we're having some really fabulous conversations with Cal Recycle, so I actually think in the next couple of years we'll see incentives and innovation happening, particularly in the organic waste stream that we haven't seen yet. So I think that's a point of optimism and feeling, despite the narrative we usually hear around government. Actually, we meet with people on a daily basis that are not just bureaucrats or technocrats, that actually are trying to do their job. They're actually very moved by climate and waste and are really trying to figure out how to ground it in the community. And so I actually feel, I've been doing work in Sacramento for over 30 years and really feel like there's a culture and community of people out there, not universally, but there are people out there that really want to partner. We just had 2 state agencies come out today on a couple of ranches to talk about what we just talked about this evening. And so it's a great, really, getting out of this sort of top-down regulatory apparatus, which we do need. You know, there's things that we need to stop, but it's really getting into this collaborative mode of like, how do we take these ideas, how do we partner with agencies to start to scale this work, and to be very humble about where we're starting. We have some really great research, a lot of potential infrastructure and agriculture delivered practices, but to get to scale, we're gonna need partnerships, we need financing, we need support from the agencies, and actually thus far, it's actually been a really great conversation. So, I worked on water and energy and had not seen this before, and I actually really feel like there's a time right now at the county level and at the state level to really push the envelope to bring these kind of solutions, but then really partnering with communities to figure out how to either land to work for farmers or to work for communities. That's the hard part. So that's where people like yourselves need to be engaged. Because if you have a generic program coming down to Sonoma around ag practices, I don't think that's enough. We have to really figure out how it's going to hit the communities, the dairies here, and the operations in a way that's going to help them. And so having that intermediary organization like ours, or people involved to help translate that for agencies who spend most of their time in Sacramento, sort of taking these ideas and really figuring out how they can work at a local level, how do we support that? And I think that's a really an important piece of this. So I just want to encourage people to stay engaged. I think we're going to hear a lot more, particularly on the organics and compost end of this conversation. And we hope Sonoma County will be a big player in that.
There was a couple of questions. John Holmes.
I'm wondering, with your experience in Sacramento, whether there's a pro-environmental lawyers club who could write, because in your discussion where you saw that they had cognitive dissonance with the idea of actually reducing carbon down to 350. In a way, that's what's prevented them from thinking of the laws. If you had a group who were prepared to accept that as not a huge paradigm shift that would shake their world, but something that would be really desirable, so looking for progressive lawyers who are in the Sacramento area to sort of get together and conspire and think tank it might be one element of a process. And then the other thing that this conversation is sparking in me is other life cycle analyses. For example, furniture with cloth in appurtenances with it, like all of our furniture and all of the cloth on the furniture must represent a huge, massive source of carbon into the environment in the form of CO2, etc., whatever. And that looks like something that would be very interesting if a parallel group could be got together to actually chase that one up.
Sounds like he just jumped in.
Yeah, he's a We know your number, so we'll call you.
I think that this soil, John called this initially sky to skin, moving CO2 into soil carbon and then into a carbohydrate in the form of cotton or carbohydrate, then a sheep eats, which becomes a protein, which then you wear. So watching carbon move through sky to skin was a life cycle assessment concept. And then we were like, whoa, wait, soil to soil, because then you compost the garment, and then that compost goes back out on a rangeland, ideally. And I think that the paradigm shift has brought to our attention what that moment of spark where you're having around furniture. It's like everything in the room needs a life cycle assessment that draws from the soil or the lithosphere. And what we noticed in life cycle assessment for clothing is that they don't start really tracking fossil fuel-based fibers in terms of their effect. They don't take up a big land mass, right? It's a pump. You're pumping oil, coal tar out of the Earth's core, and you're refining that. It doesn't take up a lot of actual square acreage. Whereas grazing sheep in New Zealand or Australia takes up a lot of land mass. And so their life cycle assessments are very skewed currently around garments because they think of fossil fuel-based fibers as having a limited Earth impact because they don't understand the carbon cycle. So if we start looking at all the material culture from this perspective of carbon cycles, it's going to transform life cycle assessment for everything. And so I think it's time to start looking at it that way. And then
if it's okay, I'd like to get a plug for the Thermopile project because this goes directly to, I thought I'm usually loud enough. What we're doing with the Thermopile project is we're using an instrument developed by Grants and Lawrence Berkeley. We're able to look at 60,000 tags of bacteria in a single chip, single test. And we're looking at the dynamics of composting. And the reason for this is John asked us if we could compost human manure safely. And I got Craig's kicking and screaming into that project, but it's been very successful. And we've been able to demonstrate that with the correct composting techniques, you can take human sanitary waste, and in a matter of days, you can get the temperatures up well over 70 degrees centigrade, and you can completely eliminate all of the gut bacteria and potential pathogens. And we've done this with essentially a no-energy system. We're working with the Soils Project in Haiti, where they're composting human waste. It's being used for crops. Heineken's is talking about they've agreed to purchase most of their output of compost for use on raising hops on the island. Also, the potential exists for reforestation programs. But what I really want to get across is the life cycle stuff, because this is how John got me hooked on the project. Each family, the average family, uses 4 tanker trailer trucks, those full-size tanker trailer trucks of water, just for flushing the toilet every year. The best of the federally mandated low flush toilets are 1.6 gallons, which is a little over 200 fluid ounces. We're now able to compost with these ultra low flush toilets from 6 fluid ounces. That's a 97% reduction in water right now. When you look at the life cycle of that, not only are those wastes not being diluted, they become valuable nutrients. We're about to become phosphate limited. We recover all of those as usable compost, which is why it's so important in places like Haiti and such like that. But the point is that if you start looking at new development, if you start looking at all of these things from, you know, the sunshine in, the photosynthesis, to dug out of the ground, and where is everything ending up, you find that there's tremendous opportunities for making huge differences. And by the way, I'll get off my soapbox, is treating waste and moving water around is very heavy. That's 19% of all the energy in California. So anyway, and you can read all about this on the Carbon Cycle website. You know, really that's what we're all about there, is studying these cycles.
Very good.
One of the points you raised I'd love to reply to, which is we're in a phosphate crisis and we haven't realized it yet, because it's not just other things, but phosphate itself is essential, crucial, and the prices are likely to skyrocket and are already going up. So if we can conserve our phosphates as well as all of the other nutrients, that would be a huge improvement.
Any other questions before we head off?
We done?
Oh, what was that?
One more question.
We do have a live feed. Was there one more question?
Yeah. You may yet touch on this, but Michael Pollan talks about the root-to-shoot ratio in his book Omnivore's Dilemma, specifically in the chapter where he's visiting Joel Salatin and his polyface farm. Salatin considers himself a grass farmer, and I believe they talk about sequestering carbon through proper grazing. So you touched on that a little bit. Maybe you could say a little more about the grazing.
That would be Jeff, root to shoot.
Well, it comes back to that earlier question about rest. The photosynthetic capture capacity of a plant is based on its leaf area, and its sequestration capacity is largely based on its root area. So, allowing a plant to photosynthesize, have enough photosynthetic area to support its own growth and the growth of all that biologically active root zone in the rhizosphere is really the driver. And so how much we defoliate that plant and thereby affect its root to shoot ratio. Obviously we reduce the shoot relative to the root when we graze it. Typically there is some root die-off that accompanies that removal of the top of the plant. So it is, I mean, that's an important piece of this, but there's no magic bullet or formula. But it's important to understand in managing a grazed system or even a garden system that that relationship between the root capacity of the plant and its above ground components is critical. And any gardener understands this. When you cut back a perennial plant, a rose bush, for example, you see it shoot vigorously in response to being cut back hard. It's because you've altered that root-shoot ratio. And similarly with a grass plant, when you graze it off and then allow it to recover, there's typically what we call compensatory growth. The plant actually grows a little more in response because you've changed that root-to-shoot ratio. So it's an important relationship, but it's going to vary all across the board with soil, plant, season, nature, defoliation, length of rest. But it's definitely a piece of understanding how you manage your farm and garden system, I guess I would say.
Well said.
And that was well said. Okay, well I think that will be it for this evening. And if any of you are managing landscapes, we're starting to collect a little bit of data. It's our composting survey. It's very short, but it's basically, would you be interested in applying compost to your rangeland? And what co-benefits are you most excited by? And we're starting to map this because we want to get an understanding of where you are and what your interests are, because it will support policy just by answering the questions. So if you don't intend to make a phone call or go to another public meeting for a while, you can send your interest and voice through this document here. So it'll be on the back table, and you can leave them with Dustin here or myself. And we're really looking forward to collecting this information. And so I just thank you for coming to educate yourselves this evening and staying on the tip of the climate change iceberg information piece. Really important because, as you know, this is a collective issue. This is global, and we share in this. So hopefully we'll be sharing in this solution in all of our towns and cities and agricultural lands together. So thank you.
Thank you.